The heavy oak doors of the citadel groaned open, a sound that signaled the end of my life as a commoner and the beginning of my existence as a prize. I was Shelia, a golden tribute plucked from a starving village, but as I walked across the cold checkered marble of the throne room, I felt less like a savior and more like a lamb led to slaughter. The air in the hall was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient stone, punctuated by the flickering warmth of wall-mounted torches. At the center of the room stood the twin kings, Derek and Donald. Seeing them together was like looking at a mirror reflecting two different kinds of storm. Derek stood with a rigid, icy grace, his dark hair pulled back, eyes scanning me with the detached precision of a man who saw the world as a game of chess. Beside him, Donald pulsed with a raw, kinetic heat, his armor scarred from battles he clearly went looking for. They were identical in face, yet opposite in soul. The silence was a physical weight until Donald broke it, his boots echoing as he closed the distance between us. Before I could recoil, his gloved hand rose, his fingers circling my throat. It wasn't an act of violence, but one of terrifying possession. He tilted my head back, forcing me to meet a gaze that burned with a hunger so primal it made my knees tremble. "He is my brother, my blood," Donald growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle my very bones. "But I will spill every drop of his royal legacy just to hear you say my name instead of his." From the shadows behind him, Derek's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Release her, Donald. She is not a beast to be broken." Derek stepped into the light, his golden eyes locking onto mine with a possessive intensity that rivaled his brother's. The twin soul prophecy had warned that I was the only anchor for their kingdom, a bridge to stop the feral curse. But as the brothers glared at one another over my head, their hands twitching toward the hilts of their swords, I realized the terrifying truth. I hadn't been brought here to save a kingdom. I had been brought here to choose which twin would live and which would be destroyed by the jealousy I had just ignited. The heavy oak doors were not a gateway, but a cage. My first night within the citadel was spent in a room that felt more like a gilded vault than a sanctuary, where the tapestries of lions seemed to watch me with judgmental eyes. I sat by the window, watching the moonlight bleed across the jagged mountain peaks, thinking of the feral curse the guards whispered about. They called me the soul anchor, the only thing standing between the twin kings and a madness that would tear the world apart. By dawn, the cold reality of my position set in. I was summoned to the High Council chamber where the Dowager Queen sat like a serpent on a throne of silver. She didn't look at me with the hunger of her sons, but with the cold calculation of an architect. "You are the key to the prophecy, Shelia," she said, her voice like ice scraping against stone. "But do not mistake your importance for power. One of my sons must be chosen to stabilize the crown. The other will be cast into the feral shadows. Your heart is the blade that will decide which one survives." Derek and Donald waited at the foot of the dais, their armor gleaming in the morning light. Derek stepped forward first, his expression unreadable but his voice softening as he addressed me. "I do not wish to be a burden on your soul, Shelia," he murmured, extending a hand clad in fine leather. "I offer you a reign of peace and a mind that will value yours above all." Before I could answer, Donald's presence surged forward, a wall of heat and unchecked dominance. He shoved past his brother, his eyes flashing with a dangerous golden light. "Peace is for the dead," he snarled, his gaze raking over me with a possessive fire that made my breath hitch. "I offer you the world at your feet and a heart that will burn down every kingdom just to keep you warm." I looked from the strategist to the warrior, feeling the invisible threads of the prophecy beginning to tighten around my chest. The jealousy between them was no longer a spark. It was a rising tide. I realized then that I wasn't just choosing a husband. I was choosing which brother to save and which to condemn to the darkness. The weight of their expectant stares was a suffocating pressure, and for the first time I felt the terrifying depth of the flaw I carried. My heart was already beginning to pull toward one, and the guilt of that preference felt like a slow-acting poison. The morning air in the Citadel Gardens was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the heavy fragrance of white roses that only bloomed in the presence of royal blood. Derek walked beside me, his steps silent against the gravel path, his hands clasped behind the small of his back. Unlike Donald's overwhelming heat, Derek exuded a cool, steady pressure, like the depths of a still lake. He stopped before a rosebush, his long fingers carefully avoiding the thorns as he clipped a single bloom and offered it to me. "My brother believes the heart is won through conquest," Derek said, his golden eyes fixing on mine with a startling vulnerability. "But a kingdom and a woman cannot be ruled by fire alone. They need a foundation. They need a strategist who thinks of the winter before the first frost falls." For a moment, the mask of the king slipped, revealing a man who lived in a state of perpetual calculation, weary from the burden of a crown he hadn't yet fully claimed. He spoke of history, of the feral curse that had claimed their ancestors, and his desire to build a legacy where no one had to be a sacrifice. I took the rose, my fingers brushing his, and felt a spark of something that wasn't fear. It was an intellectual pull, a quiet recognition of the loneliness he hid behind his ironclad logic. But even as we shared that silent moment, I felt the heavy weight of the citadel walls and the prying eyes of the Dowager Queen. I was beginning to see the man Derek was, but the shadow of Donald, his intensity, his raw need, still flickered at the edges of my mind like a forest fire I couldn't extinguish. I realized then that the strategist's rose was more than a gift. It was a plea for me to see him as an equal. Yet as a gust of wind scattered the petals at our feet, a sense of impending doom settled in my stomach. The more I leaned toward the quiet strength of one brother, the more I felt the distant, jagged roar of the other's jealousy beginning to fracture the very ground we stood on. The quiet elegance of the garden was shattered by the rhythmic, metallic ring of steel meeting steel. Donald didn't wait for permission to find us. His presence was a thunderclap that demanded attention. He stood on the edge of the training grounds, his chest heaving, sweat slicking his skin and soaking the dark leather beneath his lion-crested armor. Without a word, he beckoned me forward, his eyes burning with a primal light that made Derek's intellectual grace seem like a distant memory. "The mind can plan for winter, Shelia, but it is the blade that keeps the wolves at bay," Donald growled, his voice rough and thick with adrenaline. He thrust a practice sword into my hands, the weight of it surprising me, and stepped behind me. His heat was a physical force, his large, calloused hands guiding my arms, his breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my neck. In this proximity, his scent, blood, iron, and raw alpha dominance filled my senses until I could hardly think. He moved me through the stances with a violent kind of beauty, his body a map of scars won in the name of the crown. "Derek wants to protect you with walls and words," he whispered, his grip tightening as he forced me to strike a training dummy. "I will protect you with my life. I will be the shield that never breaks, the storm that swallows your enemies whole." Every touch ignited a fire beneath my skin, a dangerous, jagged passion that my inner wolf roared to meet. As I looked up at him, I saw the cracks in the warrior's armor, the desperate need to be seen as more than just a weapon pointed at problems. He was terrifying, a man on the verge of the feral madness the prophecy promised, and yet his devotion was a consuming flame. I felt my heart fracture further, torn between the king who offered a quiet future and the warrior who offered an all-consuming fire. The jealousy between the brothers was no longer a distant threat. As Donald stared down at me with possessive hunger, I knew the blood and iron of his world was about to spill into our reality. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the Citadel's stone balcony where I stood alone, trying to catch my breath. The internal struggle between Derek's steady logic and Donald's raw intensity had reached a breaking point within me. When a shadow detached itself from the pillars, my heart didn't leap in fear, but in a sudden, sharp recognition of the soul I truly craved. It was Derek who approached, his icy composure finally shattered by the growing desperation in the palace. He didn't speak of prophecies or kingdoms. Instead, he reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed my cheek. "I cannot lose you to his fire, Shelia," he whispered, a confession that felt more powerful than any royal decree. When he leaned in, the kiss was a slow, deep surrender, a secret confirmation of the preference I had tried so hard to hide. For a moment, the world was silent, the bond between us humming with a quiet, golden rightness. But the silence was a lie. A low, guttural snarl vibrated through the stone floor, making the hair on my neck stand up. I pulled away to see Donald standing in the archway, his eyes no longer golden, but a molten, terrifying red. He had scented the change in the air, the sweet, unmistakable scent of my arousal and my choice. The rejection hit him like a physical blow, snapping the thin tether of his self-control. "You chose him," Donald rasped, his voice sounding less like a man and more like the beast that lived beneath his skin. His muscles surged against his armor as the feral fever took hold, his body vibrating with a violent jealousy that threatened to ignite the very air. The whisper of preference had been spoken, and in Donald's eyes, I saw the end of peace. The prophecy's curse was no longer a story. It was a living, breathing monster standing right in front of us. The velvet curtains of the Dowager Queen's private chambers seemed to swallow the light, creating a sanctuary of shadows that smelled of ancient parchment and bitter herbs. I found her standing by a massive tapestry depicting a wolf torn in two, her back to me as the sounds of Donald's destructive rage echoed from the floors below. He was smashing stone and iron, his feral transition accelerated by the sting of my rejection. "You think you have made a choice of the heart, Shelia," the Dowager Queen said, turning to face me with a look of chilling pity. "But in this palace, your heart is merely a trigger for a trap set long before you were born." She moved toward a hidden alcove, pulling forth a vial of shimmering violet liquid, the same hue as the veins now bulging in Donald's neck. Love is a luxury the prophecy cannot afford, because the prophecy itself is a masterpiece of design. She revealed the jagged truth of the Dowager's web. The feral curse wasn't an inevitable act of nature, but a calculated purge. She had been poisoning the twin she deemed less fit for years, waiting for the Omega's choice to act as the final chemical catalyst to erase the spare king. My preference for Derek hadn't just broken Donald's heart. It had activated the final stage of a lethal toxin that would turn him into a mindless beast before it claimed his life. Horror turned my blood to ice. My indecisiveness hadn't been the danger, my choice was. The Queen smiled, a thin, cruel line. "Tonight, the spare will be driven into the woods to die, and the kingdom will have a singular, focused ruler. You have done exactly what was required of you." As I backed away from her, the realization shattered me. My love was being used as a weapon of execution, and the man I had rejected was being murdered by the very hand of the woman who birthed him. The heavy silence following the Queen's revelation was shattered by the sound of splintering wood and the clash of steel. I rushed from the chambers toward the great courtyard, where the first blood was already being drawn under the sickly light of a rising moon. Derek and Donald moved in a blur of lion-crested armor, their swords whistling through the air with lethal intent. This was no longer a sparring match. It was a desperate struggle for survival. Donald was barely recognizable. His skin was flushed a deep, feverish red, and his movements were erratic, fueled by a mixture of the Queen's poison and a broken heart. He fought with a reckless, suicidal intensity, his strikes heavy enough to crack the stone beneath Derek's feet. Derek, ever the strategist, parried and dodged, his face a mask of calculated grief. He didn't want to kill his brother, but the feral fever was forcing his hand. "Derek, stop!" I screamed, my voice lost in the roar of the wind. I saw Donald lunge, his blade missing Derek's throat by a fraction of an inch, only for Derek to counter with a strike that opened a jagged red line across Donald's shoulder. The sight of that blood, royal blood spilled by a twin, seemed to act as the final trigger. Donald let out a sound that was no longer human, a guttural howl that shook the very foundations of the citadel. The guards stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of their kings tearing each other apart. I realized then that the Dowager Queen was watching from above, her plan nearing its grisly completion. If I didn't find a way to break the cycle of violence, my chosen mate would be forced to become a fratricide, and the man I had rejected would die an abomination. As Donald prepared for a final lethal lunge, I saw the true stakes. The first blood wasn't just a wound. It was the beginning of the end for the brotherhood that had once ruled the world. The crimson moon climbed to its zenith, casting a sickly bioluminescent glow over the citadel that felt like a physical weight. The feral moon had arrived, and with it, the last remnants of Donald's humanity were being stripped away by the Dowager Queen's poison and the crushing weight of my rejection. He collapsed in the center of the courtyard, his armor screeching as his skeletal structure began to expand and warp in the most grotesque of ways. I watched in horror as his fingers elongated into jagged claws and his once handsome face twisted into a lupine mask of pure agony. The transformation was not the sleek, controlled shift of an alpha. It was a jagged, broken eruption of the beast within, fueled by the feral fever. Every snap of his bones sounded like a death knell for the man I had known, a man who had loved me with a fire that was now consuming his very soul. Derek stood a few paces back, his sword trembling in a hand that had always been steady. He looked at me, his golden eyes brimming with a silent, devastating plea. He knew that the brother he had shared a womb with was dying, replaced by a monster that would recognize neither blood nor bond. The air grew cold, smelling of ozone and the metallic tang of the blood Donald had already spilled. The guards began to retreat, their weapons lowering in a primal fear that no training could overcome. Only I remained, caught between the king I loved and the nightmare I had created. As Donald let out a roar that shattered the glass in the high windows, I realized that the selection ceremony was no longer just a ritual, it was a race against time. Tonight, the moon would demand a sacrifice, and as Donald's human eyes flickered one last time before turning a solid, empty red, I knew the man I had rejected was finally gone. The high altar of the selection ceremony was draped in heavy crimson silk, a mockery of the blood already spilled upon the citadel stones. I stood at the center, my blue gown a stark contrast to the encroaching darkness, as the Council of Elders and the Dowager Queen watched from their tiered seats like vultures waiting for the final breath of a dying empire. Beside me, Derek stood tall, his hand gripping mine with a strength that betrayed his internal terror. Opposite us, the thing that had been Donald paced at the edge of the torchlight, a hulking, shadowed mass of fur and fury, held back only by the silver-tipped spears of 100 trembling guards. "The hour of the soul anchor has come," the High Elder proclaimed, his voice thin against the sound of Donald's guttural, wet breathing. "Shelia, daughter of the Golden Tribute. Speak your heart and seal the fate of the crown." I looked at Derek, seeing the man who had offered me a mind to match my own, and then at the beastly silhouette of Donald, who had offered a passion that had burned too bright. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest, but the Dowager Queen's smug expression gave me the final surge of courage I needed. I didn't just speak my rejection, I spoke the truth. "I choose Derek," I cried out, my voice ringing through the hollow hall. "But I reject the law that demands my choice be a death sentence." I turned my gaze toward the Queen, pointing a trembling finger. "Donald isn't feral because of the prophecy. He is feral because his own mother has been feeding him poison for years to ensure a singular throne." The hall erupted in a cacophony of gasps and outrage. The distraction was all the opening the feral twin needed. Infuriated by the final rejection and the Queen's betrayal, the beast that was Donald lunged, his massive form shattering the silver spears like dry kindling. He didn't move toward me. He moved toward the dais where his mother sat. Chaos exploded as the beast's roar met the Queen's scream, and the truth of the Dowager's web was finally written in the wreckage of the altar. In the flickering firelight, the prophecy died, replaced by a desperate struggle for a kingdom that was finally waking up to the monster who had truly been ruling it. The sun rose over a citadel that felt like a hollowed-out shell, the morning light revealing the true cost of a crown forged in blood and betrayal. The Dowager Queen was gone, consumed by the very feral rage she had spent years cultivating in her own son, leaving the throne room a wreckage of silver and silk. Donald, the warrior who had loved me with a fire that eventually turned to ash, had disappeared into the shadowed mountains after the final massacre, his monstrous form a ghost of the brother he used to be. Derek stood beside me on the ruined dais, his grip on my hand the only thing anchoring me to the earth. He was no longer the calculated strategist who saw the world as a game of chess. He was a king who had lost half of his soul and all of his family in a single night. Together, we looked out over the parapets at a kingdom that was finally breathing for the first time in generations, free from the poison of a false prophecy and the manipulations of a mother's greed. The restoration was not a celebration, but a quiet, grueling labor. We abolished the Golden Tribute and the ancient laws that treated Omegas as political tools, building a new council from the commoners and soldiers who had witnessed the truth of the royal bloodline. My father's pack, hearing of my rise to power, sent emissaries to claim credit for my success, but I turned them away at the gate, realizing that I was no longer defined by where I came from, but by the choice I had been brave enough to make. As the seasons turned, the Citadel's gardens were replanted, not with the white roses of royal blood, but with wildflowers from the villages. There was a bittersweet peace in our rule, a quiet love built on the shared trauma of survival. Sometimes, when the moon hung low and crimson, we would hear a distant, lonely howl from the deep woods, a reminder of the brother lost to the feral shadows. Derek would tighten his hold on me then, and I would lean into his strength, knowing that while we had saved the kingdom, the crown of ashes would always be a heavy weight to bear. We had found love, but it was a love that lived in the quiet spaces between the memories of what we had been forced to destroy. If you enjoyed this dark gothic romance, please like the video, comment below with which twin you would have chosen, and subscribe for more thrilling tales of love and betrayal.